I accidentally entered the royal alien bath, and I saw something I should never have seen. Ethan Shaw had never intended to get lost. He was used to high-stakes situations, diplomatic missions, peace talks, even the occasional firefight. But this was different. He had never imagined that a simple mistake could lead to the chaos he was about to face. It had all started with the arrival of the peace delegation on Varnak Prime, the capital planet of the Varnak Empire. The Varnak were a powerful alien race, known for their immense size, near-perfect physical capabilities, and strict social hierarchy. Humans had only recently made contact with the Varnak, and as an official envoy, Ethan had been sent to ensure that the delicate negotiations between the two species went smoothly. But things were tense, very tense. Every conversation was weighed with the threat of misunderstanding. Every gesture, every word seemed to be scrutinized under a magnifying glass. As a soldier-turned-diplomat, Ethan was used to the subtle nuances of alien cultures, but even he felt the pressure here. The Varnak had their own ways of doing things, and those ways were not always in line with human values. Still, he pressed on. He spent long days in the palace, negotiating with various Varnak representatives, some of whom seemed downright hostile toward humans. The quiet hum of the palace halls felt oppressive. Even the air felt thick with the weight of history and power. The palace itself was a marvel, vast and imposing, built with towering spires and crystalline structures that seemed to pulse with energy. But after one particularly difficult round of talks, Ethan's patience wore thin. His legs ached, and his mind felt foggy. He needed a break, a moment of peace before he had to meet with the delegation again. So he left the conference room and made his way down the palace hallways, searching for some place to unwind. Ethan had been told that the royal baths were off-limits to outsiders. That much he knew. The Varnak had a strict code of privacy when it came to their sacred rituals, and no human had ever been allowed inside the royal bathhouse. But it was late, and the hallways were empty, the shadows stretching long under the faint glow of the palace's bioluminescent lights. Ethan wandered, his thoughts drifting. He hadn't meant to wander that far, but when he turned the corner and found himself facing a large, ornately carved door, he paused. It wasn't marked, but the symbol above the door seemed familiar, like something from the ancient texts he'd been briefed on before arriving. Curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the door open just a crack, intending only to peek inside. Perhaps it was another room, another part of the palace he could explore, some quiet space to collect his thoughts. But as soon as the door creaked open, he heard the faint sound of voices. Low, melodic voices. Ethan froze. The voices were singing or chanting, it was hard to tell. But they were unmistakably coming from within. He should have turned back, he knew that. But something about the sound, the way it echoed down the hallway, pulling him in like a magnet, he couldn't resist. He stepped inside. The room beyond was vast, larger than any bathroom he'd ever seen. The walls were lined with glowing, translucent stone, and the air was warm and thick with the scent of fragrant oils. Pools of water stretched out before him, rippling gently in the dim light. The atmosphere felt serene, almost sacred. Ethan stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest, eyes wide as he took in the beauty of the space. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the light, he saw them. Two figures standing in the center of the largest pool. One was taller than anyone he had ever seen, her figure regal and commanding, with sharp features and eyes that gleamed like molten gold. Her skin shimmered like liquid metal, almost translucent in the water. The other was smaller, her frame delicate and youthful, with long, dark hair flowing down her back. Both women were completely undressed, their bodies lithe and graceful as they moved through the water. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, caught between panic and awe. He had never seen anything like this before. These beings, these Varnak women, were beautiful, powerful, and vulnerable. There was something about the way the water caressed their skin, the way the ritual seemed to flow in sync with their movements. It was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. His breath caught in his throat. He had made a mistake, a huge mistake. He was not supposed to be here. His military training kicked in as panic began to flood his mind and he turned to flee. But then he heard her voice. "You should not be here, human." The voice was low, commanding, and filled with an ancient authority. It stopped him in his tracks. Ethan turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, and found himself face to face with the taller woman, the one who had been standing in the center of the pool. Her gaze was like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Her eyes, golden, piercing, locked onto his with an intensity that felt as though they were reading every thought in his mind. I'm sorry, Ethan stammered, his words barely forming. I didn't mean to intrude. I thought this was a— Silence, she interrupted, her voice like thunder. You have entered a sacred space, a place where only Varnak are allowed. Do you not understand the gravity of your mistake? Ethan swallowed hard, struggling to regain his composure. He had made a huge blunder. He was not only trespassing, but he had also violated a sacred Varnak tradition. The consequences of his actions could be severe. He knew that. But in that moment, all he could think of was the overwhelming presence of the woman before him. She stepped closer, her movements graceful despite the harshness in her words. The water seemed to part around her like she was a living embodiment of power. I was unaware, Ethan said, hoping his words would diffuse the situation. I didn't know this place was off limits. Of course you didn't, she replied with a dry smile. You humans are always so quick to assume, but ignorance is no excuse. She eyed him for a moment longer, then turned her gaze toward the smaller woman, her daughter, Ethan presumed. The younger woman was watching him intently, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she wasn't as displeased with him as her mother was. Leave, the queen commanded, her voice colder now, before you cause more harm. Ethan nodded quickly and took a step back, but just as he turned toward the door, the queen spoke again. You are not excused yet, human. Ethan froze again, his hand still on the door. What now? What more could he do to avoid making the situation worse? The queen's voice softened almost imperceptibly. You may leave, but know this, your actions will have consequences. You have seen what few outsiders have. The Varnak are not so forgiving. Ethan's stomach twisted. He couldn't be sure if she was threatening him or simply stating the truth. Either way, he had just made a massive mistake. And now there was no going back. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the royal bath. It had been a full day since he had inadvertently stumbled into that sacred space. But the image of the Varnak queen and her daughter, their serene yet commanding presence, still lingered in his mind. He had expected to be punished, maybe thrown out of the palace or worse, sent back to Earth in disgrace. But none of those things had happened. Instead, he had been left to wait, locked in a room with no explanation of what would happen next. The palace seemed quieter than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. He knew the Varnak had their ways, their rituals, their rules that were completely foreign to humans, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer power that emanated from Queen Alara. She wasn't just the ruler of the Varnak Empire, she was the embodiment of its history, its traditions, and its very soul. Her authority was undeniable, and it was something that Ethan couldn't ignore, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The palace seemed to follow him everywhere he went. He knew that even in the quietest corners, someone was observing him, probably waiting for him to make another mistake. Ethan had expected a stern reprimand, maybe even an execution. That's what would happen on Earth if someone trespassed in such a manner. But the Varnak were different, more mysterious. After the queen's command, he had been left alone in a lavish guest room, with walls adorned with intricate designs and soft light filtering through crystal windows. The bed was huge, too large for a single human, and the fabrics on the bed felt like something from another world. Everything in the room screamed wealth, power, and a history that spanned centuries. It was a reminder that he was very far from home. At first, he had paced the room, waiting for an explanation, some sign that this mistake could be fixed. But as the hours passed, the uncertainty grew, gnawing at his insides. What would happen to him now? Was this some kind of test? Was the queen testing his resolve, his ability to endure the consequences of his actions? Or was it something more? Ethan had a sinking feeling that the Varnak were much more calculating than anyone gave them credit for. The silence was broken by a soft knock on the door. Ethan's heart leapt in his chest. He wasn't expecting visitors, and certainly not anyone from the royal court. He opened the door to find a tall, elegant Varnak woman standing there. Her skin shimmered in the light, her eyes glowing faintly like the queen's. But this woman's presence wasn't as imposing as the queen's. She was younger, with an air of curiosity about her, as if she were sizing him up. You are to follow me, she said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, unsure of what to expect. He didn't question her. He knew he had no choice but to comply. He followed her through the winding corridors of the palace, the walls still pulsating with energy. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the halls, though the palace seemed mostly empty, as if everyone had gone into hiding because of his mistake. The woman led him down a set of grand stairs and into a large chamber at the heart of the palace. The room was circular, with an enormous domed ceiling that seemed to reach up forever. It was filled with art, sculptures, and holographic images of the Varnak's ancient history. But what caught Ethan's attention was the central platform in the middle of the room. It was elevated, and upon it stood a single figure. It was the Queen. Her presence was even more overwhelming than before. She stood tall, her hands clasped behind her back, gazing down at him with those golden eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. Ethan felt small, insignificant under her gaze, as though every mistake he had ever made was laid bare before her. He instinctively straightened his posture, hoping that his appearance might convey some sense of respect. "You came here by mistake, human," she said, her voice low and measured, as though choosing her words carefully. "But I believe that there is more to your presence here than mere chance." Ethan swallowed. "I didn't mean to." "I know what you meant," she interrupted. "But what matters now is that you are here. You've seen what no outsider should see, and yet you're still alive. That alone is curious." Ethan didn't know what to say. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had no doubt that this was a test, one that could change everything. His fate rested on what he did next. "You have violated Varnak traditions," the Queen continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You are not the first to do so, but you are the first to be forgiven." Ethan blinked. "Forgiven?" The Queen's lips curved into a slight smile. "Yes, I have decided to let you live. But there is a condition." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Of course there was a condition, there always was. "What is it?" "You will aid us," she said, her voice unwavering. "There is something you can do, something that only a human can accomplish." "I am not asking for your help, I am demanding it." Ethan's mind raced. What could she possibly want from him? What did he have that could help the Varnak? He wasn't a diplomat. He wasn't even sure how to handle himself in a foreign culture, let alone navigate the complex political dynamics of an alien empire. But the Queen's gaze told him that refusal was not an option. "I don't know what you're asking," he said cautiously. "What do you want me to do?" The Queen's gaze softened slightly, and she stepped closer, the power in her presence palpable. "There is a sacred relic, a powerful artifact hidden in the crystalline caverns beneath this palace. It is a key to restoring the balance in our empire. Without it, we face a great crisis, but we cannot retrieve it. It is bound by ancient magic, and only a human, someone who has not been touched by Varnak power, can reach it." Ethan frowned. "And you want me to go into these caverns and retrieve this artifact?" "Yes," the Queen said, nodding. "But it is not so simple. The caverns are fraught with danger. The artifact is guarded by traps, creatures, and forces that will stop at nothing to prevent you from reaching it. The Trelli, an ancient enemy of the Varnak, have already learned of the artifact's importance and are seeking to claim it for themselves. They will do anything to stop you." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had barely survived the peace talks, and now he was being sent on a mission that sounded like a suicide run. But there was something in the Queen's eyes, a glimmer of hope, or perhaps a challenge, that made him hesitate. "Why me?" he asked. "Why not send your own people?" "Because only you, a human, are untainted by our magic," the Queen replied. "You are an outsider, and that is why you are the only one who can succeed where others would fail." Ethan didn't know what to think. The risks were immense, but the alternative, failure, destruction, was even worse. He wasn't about to let that happen. He had no choice. He nodded slowly. "I'll do it." The Queen's gaze softened ever so slightly. "Good, you have proven that you are not a fool. Go now and return to us with the artifact. If you succeed, the Varnak will owe you a debt. But if you fail—" Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. Failure meant death. "Understood," Ethan said, though he wasn't sure what he had just agreed to. But in that moment he knew one thing: he had to do this. For the Varnak, for himself, and for the future of his people. The Queen turned away, her voice cold and final. "Then go, you have no time to waste." Ethan turned to leave, but before he could take a step, he caught sight of Princess Vera watching him from the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him feel like he wasn't completely alone in this. He gave her a small nod, and she returned it, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than he expected. With a deep breath, Ethan turned and stepped into the unknown, knowing that what lay ahead would shape not just his future, but the future of both humans and Varnak. Ethan's mind raced as he made his way toward the crystalline caverns. His heart pounded in his chest with every step, his boots echoing softly in the quiet, ancient halls of the Varnak Palace. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. The Queen had made it clear. Failure wasn't an option. He had to succeed, not just for his survival, but for the future of both humanity and the Varnak. As he walked, he couldn't help but think of the events that had led him here. One simple mistake, a single misstep into a forbidden space, and now he was on a mission that could change the course of history. The Queen's words echoed in his mind. Only a human can retrieve the artifact. You are untainted by our magic. You are the only one who can succeed. The pressure weighed heavily on him, but as he thought about what was at stake, his resolve hardened. He had to do this. The Varnak had long held dominion over their galaxy, a civilization that had stood the test of time. Their power wasn't just in their strength, but in the ancient artifacts and rituals they guarded fiercely. The artifact he was supposed to retrieve was one such relic, an item that, if it fell into the wrong hands, could tip the balance of power across the entire galaxy. If the Trelli, the enemies of the Varnak, found it first, the consequences would be catastrophic. Ethan's mind wandered back to the conversation with Queen Alara. Her eyes had burned with intensity, but there had been something else there too. A sense of urgency, a deep fear for her people. She had given him this task because she believed that a human, untouched by the magic of the Varnak, was the only one who could retrieve the artifact safely. But he wondered if that was the full truth. His thoughts were interrupted as he reached a large stone door at the end of the hallway. The door was unlike anything he'd seen before, ancient and intricate, with carvings of long-forgotten symbols. It was adorned with glowing runes that pulsed softly, as if alive. Ethan hesitated before reaching for the handle, his heart racing. This was it, the entrance to the crystalline caverns. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The air on the other side was cool, damp, and filled with the scent of earth and stone. The entrance to the caverns was narrow, but as he stepped inside, the path widened, revealing a vast underground landscape. The walls were lined with crystals of every color, glowing in shades of blue, purple, and green. They cast an eerie, otherworldly light across the cavern, illuminating the path ahead. Ethan could feel the weight of the place, the centuries of history buried deep within the stone. These caverns had been here long before the Varnak, long before humanity had ever ventured into the stars. The power that emanated from the crystals was palpable, and for a moment, he wondered if the Varnak had always known that this place held more than just beauty. There was a strange energy here, something ancient and powerful. He started walking cautiously, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. The Queen had warned him about the treacherous nature of the caverns, about the traps and the creatures that lurked in the shadows. His hand rested on the hilt of the small knife he had been given, but he knew it would do little against whatever threats lay ahead. The path twisted and turned, leading him deeper into the heart of the caverns. The further he went, the darker it became. The crystals provided little light now, and the only sounds he could hear were the soft echoes of his footsteps and the distant dripping of water. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled, barely catching himself before he fell. He looked down to see that the floor had become slick, coated with a thin layer of slime. His heart skipped a beat. This was it, the beginning of the traps the Queen had warned him about. He carefully stood up, wiping his hands on his pants as he took in his surroundings. There were no obvious dangers ahead, but something felt off. He could sense movement in the shadows. Something was watching him. Before he could react, a sharp, high-pitched screech filled the air. Ethan spun around just in time to see a shadow dart toward him. A creature, hunched and twisted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, lunged at him. Ethan drew his knife instinctively, slashing at the creature as it closed in. The blade made contact, but it didn't seem to faze the beast. It snarled, its teeth sharp and pointed, and its claws reached for his throat. He sidestepped just in time, his heart racing. The creature hissed, turning back to face him. Ethan's mind raced as he scanned the area for something, anything, to use as a weapon. But there was nothing. He was alone, and the creature was closing in again. Desperation clawed at him, but he didn't panic. He had been trained for situations like this. Calm, focused. He had to outsmart the creature, not just fight it. Thinking quickly, he spotted a cluster of rocks on the cavern floor. He grabbed one, hurling it at the creature's face. The distraction was enough. The creature recoiled, momentarily stunned, giving Ethan the opening he needed. He lunged forward, using the knife to strike at the creature's side. It howled in pain, but this time the blade did its job. The creature staggered back, blood dripping from its wound. With a final screech, it collapsed to the ground, dead. Ethan exhaled sharply, his heart still racing. He had barely survived the first threat. How many more would he face before he reached the artifact? And would he be able to make it back alive? He took another deep breath and continued onward, his nerves on edge. As he pressed forward, the path began to widen again and the air grew colder. He could see a faint light in the distance, the glow of something powerful. It was the artifact. But just as he was about to move closer, a loud rumbling filled the air. The ground shook beneath him, and he barely managed to keep his balance. The crystals lining the walls seemed to shift, their glow intensifying. Something was happening. The rumbling grew louder, and Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that he wasn't alone in this part of the cavern. The Trelli were here. From the shadows, a group of alien soldiers emerged, their black armor gleaming in the light. They moved silently, like predators stalking their prey. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had heard of the Trelli ruthless, merciless, and cunning. They had always been the enemy of the Varnak, and now they had come to claim the artifact for themselves. Ethan gripped his knife tightly, his mind racing. There were too many of them, and he was outmatched. But he couldn't let them get the artifact, not after everything he had been through. His heart pounding, Ethan darted forward, using the terrain to his advantage. He ducked behind rocks, staying out of sight as he moved closer to the artifact. But the Trelli weren't fooled for long. They began to fan out, searching for him. Ethan's mind raced, calculating his options. He couldn't fight them all, but there had to be a way. Then he saw it, the artifact. It was sitting on a pedestal, glowing with an ethereal light. It was beautiful, powerful, and ancient, just like the Queen had described. But he couldn't reach it yet. He needed a plan. He waited, watching the Trelli as they moved closer to the pedestal. His hand went to his belt, where he still had a small explosive device he had been given as part of his mission. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to create a distraction. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ethan activated the device and threw it across the cavern. The explosion rang out, deafening in its intensity, and the Trelli soldiers turned in alarm. The ground shook again as the explosion echoed through the cavern. Now was his chance. Ethan ran toward the pedestal, ignoring the chaos around him. The Trelli were distracted, and he knew this was his only shot. He reached the artifact just as the Trelli regrouped. His hand closed around it, and he felt a surge of energy course through his body, filling him with power. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. He didn't have time to process it. With the artifact in hand, he turned and ran, weaving through the shadows to escape the Trelli. His heart pounded in his chest, his legs burning with every step. The Trelli were close behind, but Ethan had the artifact. Now all he had to do was get out of the caverns alive. The weight of the artifact in Ethan's hands was both a blessing and a curse. As he sprinted through the winding paths of the crystalline caverns, the sharp edges of the crystals seemed to close in on him, their eerie glow flashing in his peripheral vision. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his legs burned with the effort of running. Every step felt like it could be his last. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. The Trelli were relentless. The explosion he had set off earlier had given him a brief window of escape, but he could already hear the Trelli regrouping, their footsteps echoing through the cavern. They were faster than he had anticipated, and their hunting instincts were far more precise than he had hoped. The fact that he had the artifact made him a target, and that target was becoming increasingly harder to outrun. The artifact itself, though small and unassuming in shape, felt like a living thing in his hands. It pulsed with energy, a strange, almost comforting sensation that flowed through him with each step. For a moment, he wondered what it would mean for him if he made it out alive, what kind of power this object could bring. But there was no time for that. He needed to focus on the immediate danger. Getting out of the caverns was all that mattered now. He turned a sharp corner, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Trelli were closing in. He could hear their voices now, harsh and guttural, as they shouted orders to each other. They were too close. He couldn't outrun them much longer. He needed a plan. Ethan ducked behind a large cluster of crystals, pressing his back to the cool stone wall. He could feel his pulse in his throat, the adrenaline coursing through him in waves. The Trelli weren't far off. He had no idea how many of them were following him, but he knew they were all well-trained hunters, capable of tracking him down with ease. Their superior senses and technology would make it nearly impossible for him to escape unless he could outsmart them. His mind raced as he scanned the cavern. His eyes locked on a narrow gap between two large crystal formations just ahead. It was tight, but it could be the perfect hiding spot if he could make it there undetected. Taking a deep breath, Ethan adjusted his grip on the artifact and moved quickly but quietly toward the gap. He knew he couldn't take any more chances. The Trelli would be here any second, and if they spotted him, it would be over. He slipped into the gap just as the sound of Trelli footsteps grew louder. His heart was in his throat as he crouched low, hiding in the shadows of the cavern. The glow of the crystals cast faint light on the ground, but the Trelli were still out of sight. They were close, but they hadn't seen him yet. Ethan's mind raced. He had to think. If he didn't get out of here soon, the Trelli would corner him. He needed to get back to the surface, to the Varnak Palace, where he could return the artifact and complete his mission. But how? There were no obvious exits, and the Trelli were blocking every possible path. As the Trelli continued their search, Ethan's eyes flicked around the cavern, looking for anything he could use. That's when he saw it, an old, weathered tunnel at the far side of the cavern. It was small, barely wide enough for him to fit through, but it was an exit, and it might be his only chance. Without thinking twice, Ethan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the burning in his legs as he sprinted toward the tunnel. The Trelli were still distracted, but their voices were getting louder. He had seconds, maybe less, to make it to the tunnel before they saw him. He reached the entrance just as the Trelli turned toward him. He dived into the tunnel, barely squeezing through before the first Trelli soldier spotted him. The sound of boots pounding the stone floor filled the air, but Ethan didn't stop. He crawled through the tunnel, his body scraping against the rough walls as he pushed himself forward. The tunnel was long and winding, and the air grew thick with dust and the smell of earth. It was clear that no one had used this path in centuries. It was the perfect escape route, but as he continued, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Trelli weren't far behind. He could hear their voices again, muffled but still audible, and he knew they were closing in. Ethan's heart raced as he crawled faster, his muscles aching with every movement. He had no idea where the tunnel would lead, but he couldn't afford to slow down now. He was too close to giving up, to failure, and that wasn't an option. He couldn't let the Trelli win. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to widen. The air grew cooler, fresher. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dim light ahead, and he realized that he had reached the end. A small opening at the far side of the tunnel revealed a narrow, rocky passageway that led up toward the surface. It was steep, but it was a way out. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting the sudden movement, but he didn't care. He was so close. The Trelli were still in the tunnel, but they were far enough behind now that he had a chance to make it to the surface. With one last burst of energy, he started climbing. Every step felt like a challenge, but the thought of the artifact in his hands, the mission he had to complete, kept him going. As he reached the top of the passageway, the cool night air hit him. He had made it. He had survived. But as he stumbled out onto the surface, a new problem presented itself. The Varnak Palace was still miles away. He was far from the safety of the Queen's protection, and the Trelli could easily find him again if they tracked his movements. He had to move quickly. His legs felt like jelly as he ran across the rocky terrain, the weight of the artifact in his hands now a reminder of the responsibility he carried. He had no idea how he would get back to the palace, but he knew one thing: he had to get there. The artifact had to be returned, and the Trelli had to be stopped. If he failed, it would mean disaster for the Varnak, and possibly for humanity as well. Ethan's thoughts turned to Princess Vera. He had seen the way she looked at him when he left the palace, that mixture of worry and determination in her eyes. She had defied her mother's orders to follow him into the caverns. He had to make it back for her, for all of them. The fate of the Varnak, and perhaps the future of human-Varnak relations, rested in his hands. As he ran, he caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a shadow moving against the night sky. Ethan slowed his pace, his instincts kicking in. The Trelli were still out there, and they were closing in once again. He was too far from the palace, and the Trelli were too close. But there was no turning back now. He had made it this far. He would finish the mission. He had to. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the rocky terrain, the weight of the artifact still clutched tightly in his hands. His legs burned with every step, his muscles protesting the long journey from the caverns. The cool night air filled his lungs, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm of adrenaline that raged inside him. The Trelli were close, too close, and he had no idea how much longer he could keep running. Every time he thought he had outrun them, he'd hear the faint sound of pursuit in the distance. He didn't need to see them to know they were still out there, hunting him, determined to take the artifact for themselves. But he couldn't stop, not now, not after everything he had been through. He had a mission to complete, and the Varnak were depending on him. The moon was high in the sky, casting pale light across the barren landscape. Ethan's eyes darted to the horizon, searching for any sign of the palace, the only place where he could find refuge. But the distance felt endless, and every step seemed to take him farther from safety. He glanced down at the artifact in his hands. It was still glowing softly, the pulse of its energy resonating through his palms. The Queen had warned him of its power, how it could restore balance to the Varnak Empire, but only if it was returned to its rightful place. She had entrusted him with it, and he couldn't afford to fail. With the Trelli still on his tail, Ethan knew he had no time to waste. His thoughts raced as he scanned the landscape, trying to plan his next move. But all he could think of was getting back to the palace. He had to warn the Queen. He had to return the artifact before the Trelli got their hands on it. Just as his legs threatened to give out beneath him, he saw a familiar silhouette in the distance. His heart leapt in his chest. It was the palace. He had made it. The towering spires of the Varnak stronghold loomed ahead, casting long shadows over the rocky plains. But there was no time to celebrate. The Trelli were closing in fast, and Ethan knew he wouldn't make it to the palace without a fight. He pushed himself forward, his body protesting with every step, but his determination was stronger than his exhaustion. The palace gates were within reach now, and he could see the guards on the walls, their eyes scanning the horizon. But as he neared the gates, a new wave of dread washed over him. The Trelli weren't far behind, and he knew that if they caught up with him before he got inside, the artifact would be lost forever. His mind raced as he searched for a way to outsmart the Trelli. The guards were watching the gates, and there was no way he could slip past them unnoticed. He couldn't risk being captured. But then he remembered the side entrance, the one the Varnak used to enter and exit the palace unseen. It was a long shot, but it was his only chance. Ethan veered to the right, heading for the hidden entrance. He could hear the Trelli gaining on him, their footsteps echoing in the night. He had to move faster. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed his legs to go faster, ignoring the pain in his muscles. The side entrance was just ahead. He could make it. But as he reached the entrance, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The Trelli had already found it. A group of Trelli soldiers were stationed outside the entrance, their black armor blending into the shadows. They were waiting for him. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to come up with a new plan, but there was no time. The Trelli were too close, and he was trapped. He turned to face the soldiers, his back against the stone wall of the palace. His hand gripped the artifact tighter, his fingers cold and stiff. There was no more running, no more tricks. He had to fight. The Trelli stepped forward, their eyes glowing with menace. They knew they had him cornered. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't back down. He would not let them take the artifact, not without a fight. "I don't want to hurt you," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "But I will if I have to." The lead Trelli soldier smirked, his sharp teeth visible in the dim light. "You think you can stop us, human?" he sneered. "We have the power to destroy you and everything you hold dear." Ethan's fingers flexed around the artifact. He wasn't afraid of the Trelli. He had been trained for moments like this. He knew that his best chance was to stay calm and use the terrain to his advantage. The Trelli lunged, and Ethan reacted without thinking. He ducked low, using the momentum of the soldier's charge to push him into the stone wall. The Trelli grunted in surprise, but Ethan didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed the soldier's arm and twisted, using the element of surprise to disarm him. The other Trelli soldiers moved in quickly, but Ethan was ready. He kicked one soldier in the stomach, sending him stumbling backward, and then elbowed another in the face. The Trelli were fast, but they weren't invincible. Ethan's heart raced as he fought, his movements quick and precise. The artifact pulsed in his hands as if urging him forward. He could feel its energy building inside him, giving him strength. But he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. He had to get to the Queen. With a final push, Ethan knocked the last Trelly soldier to the ground. The rest of them were temporarily disoriented, but Ethan knew that wouldn't last long. He had only seconds before they regrouped and attacked again. Without a second thought, he dashed toward the palace gates, the artifact still gripped tightly in his hand. The guards on the wall saw him and raised their weapons, but he didn't stop. The gates creaked open, and he ran inside, barely making it before the Trelly regrouped. The palace doors slammed shut behind him, and he collapsed against the stone wall, gasping for breath. He had made it. He had actually made it. Ethan's vision swam for a moment as the adrenaline began to wear off, but he forced himself to stand. The artifact was still safe. He had completed his mission. Now all he had to do was return it to the Queen. As he staggered through the palace corridors, he saw familiar faces, Varnak guards, palace servants, but none of them dared to approach him. The weight of the artifact in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each step. He was almost there. Finally, he reached the Queen's chambers. The guards at the door stepped aside, recognizing him immediately. Ethan entered the room and found Queen Alara standing by the large window, her back to him. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice hoarse. "I've completed the mission." The Queen turned to face him, her golden eyes scanning him up and down. She was as regal and imposing as ever, but there was a softness in her gaze as she took in the state he was in. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and his body covered in sweat. But the artifact was still in his hands. That was all that mattered. "You've done it, human," the Queen said, her voice steady. "You have proven yourself more than worthy." Ethan nodded, but he felt no sense of pride. He was too tired, too drained. All he wanted was to hand over the artifact and rest. "I don't know what this artifact will do," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, "but I believe it's going to change everything." The Queen smiled slightly. "It will," she said. "You've saved my people. And perhaps you've saved your own as well." Ethan looked at her, his eyes tired but determined. "I don't need saving, I just wanted to do what was right." And with that, he handed her the artifact. She took it in her hands, her eyes reflecting the power it held. And for the first time since he had entered this strange world, Ethan felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had done what he came to do, and now it was up to the Varnak to decide what came next.